Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Janet Rosenzweig, and I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of APSAC, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you here today for our webinar on intrafamilial child torture, being presented by Pamela J. Miller, who's a fellow with our APSAC Center for Child Policy. We're delighted to be able to bring this event to you today. Before we get to this event, I want to talk to you about a few other things that APSAC has got coming up. You'll notice on the right side of your screen, we've got several wonderful experiences we'd like to welcome you to join. We've got an 8-week course that has started, but people are welcome to join us in process, featuring national experts on multiple current topics. Our well-known forensic interview clinic is just about sold out for the one starting in May. There's 2 seats left. So if anyone in your community is interested, please grab that. We do have scholarships available for law enforcement personnel in underserved communities. So even if you're not a forensic interviewer, but you're in a community that's lacking a forensic interview, please let law enforcement personnel in your community know we've got this opportunity for them. Our webinar series are ongoing, our roundtables are ongoing, and our online course is very, very popular. And for those of you who are joining us today who may be teaching virtually during COVID or going forward, it's fabulous content that you might want to consider for your coursework. Please mark your calendar. Our renowned colloquia will be held July 12th through 15th. We've got over 100 workshops, 13 tracks, wonderful content ready for you. And I'll be putting links so you can follow up on these things in our chat box as we go forward. A little technical advice today, although by now most folks are quite used to Zoom, but if you're not, you'll enjoy this more if you set your view to speaker mode. In speaker mode, you'll see the speaker's slides and the speaker's face. We ask that you set yourself to mute. We will do that for you, but if you unmute yourself, please be sure to mute back. It is now my pleasure. This event is being presented in cooperation with our partners at the Institute for Human Services, who sponsors the APSAC Center for Child Policy. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Judy Reiches, who's the Senior Director of that project.
Thank you, Janet. Hi, welcome to everybody. I'm really glad there's such a good turnout. I can tell you a little bit about the Center for Child Policy, but the website can do it a whole lot better than I can in a much shorter time. And you'll see on the bottom of the slide is the web address for the Policy Center. In short, the purpose of the Policy Center was to produce usable resources for people working in the field to deal with highly conflictual dilemma issues, challenges, based on what the best available evidence tells us. So our goal is to do the research on what the evidence says and summarize it in policy white papers. But because our goal is transformational to actually put research into practice, we also spend a good bit of time trying to figure out what people should do tomorrow, even in the absence of really strong data. Simply because we need to do best practice when it's called for, not 10 years from now when research is available to support what we're doing. So we've handled a number of topics that do present some challenges for the field. One, as an example, was abusive head trauma and what happens in court as a way of not allowing prosecutors to do what they need to in order to get justice for children who've suffered abusive head trauma. We've done one on differential response. There are several others. They're all posted on the website. You can see them. This one's a little bit different because this is a topic that's really, really critical to practice, but there isn't very much research available. And our goal in addressing this, and I think Pamela will probably explain that this is the first in what's intended to be a series of papers on this topic, is to lay out what intrafamilial child torture is, what it looks like, what we know about it, to try to put people's attention to it, put it on the radar, and hopefully generate research that will help us better understand it, because these are kids that are at seriously high risk of long-term, often permanent disability and harm if we don't intervene. And that was the rationale for taking on this topic. Feel free to call us, contact us if you have issues or questions. If you want to be a part of any of our work, we work with committees and in partnership with lots of folks. And with that, Pamela, I'm going to turn it over to you, I think, and let you take it.
Well,
All
before
right.
Pamela
Oh, sorry.
starts, I'd
Go
like
ahead,
to
Jen.
just invite Alana Feldman, APSAC's Manager of Educational Programs, to give us a brief introduction of our speaker. Alana.
Thank you.
Sure. Really quick, folks. Pamela J. Miller, in addition to being a policy analyst with the Center for Child Policy and a member of APSAC's Amicus Committee, is a licensed independent social worker supervisor and attorney. She is previously the founder and executive director of the Children's Justice Project and a psychotherapist at Lighthouse Youth and Family Services. She consults in complex cases, testifies as a social scientist, and trains child maltreatment professionals in evidence-based methods. She has been published in the Journal of Social Work, in the APSAC Advisor, and has published numerous white papers on issues in child maltreatment, including intrafamilial child torture, sex abuse disclosures in young children, and family separation in the US-Mexico border. So please, without further ado, welcome Pamela Miller.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead here and share my screen. All right, can everybody see the first slide? Ilana, can you see the first slide?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Thank you so much for the support of APSAC and the APSAC Center for Child Policy, operated by Institute for Human Services. We'll go ahead and get started on this topic today. So this is just a little outline of what we're going to talk about. We're going to spend the first part talking about conceptualizing intrafamilial child torture, which we shorten as ICT, as a new category of child maltreatment. And then we're going to take a look at some real life case examples to help illustrate the principles we'll discuss. So most people get their first exposure to intrafamilial child torture from news in the mainstream media news. So there is a particularly infamous family that was covered by the national media in January 2018, the Turpin family. This was the case in California, where there were a house full of children allegedly being homeschooled. And one day a 17-year-old girl jumped out a window of the house, found an old cell phone that would still call 911, and reported that she and her siblings were being held captive by their parents in the family home. The police responded and found children from age 2 all the way up to 29-year-old children who were held captive, shackled to beds. They were starving, they were filthy. They were chained to the furniture as punishment. Most of the children couldn't read, even though they were of reading age. They didn't know what year it was, or even have the concept of a year or dates or ways to measure time. They didn't know what a police officer was. And when the police told them that they were going to take them to the hospital to see if they needed any medicine, the children didn't know what medicine was. So this was a family that got particularly a lot of notice, and you may recall as sort of an example to start off of conceptualizing the ICT phenomenon. So what was interesting about this case is that although the children were kept mostly isolated, not allowed to attend school, they did have some exposure to the outside world, and there were red flags that community members picked up on, but unfortunately didn't have the education or the support to know or feel confident in calling CPS. So after the children were rescued, the media talked to neighbors who said, I saw the children would march in circles around the backyard all night, and it was very concerning, but I didn't know what to do. One neighbor even used the term red flags and said, yes, I saw red flags. I saw all these different children that looked emaciated, but when I chatted with the parents, going out to the mailbox to get the mail at the same time, the parents seemed nice and normal. And so no call to CPS there. The same neighbor said he assumed that all the Turpin children must have some sort of genetic disease or developmental disorder to explain why they were all emaciated. And this picture might jog your memory now of this case. This family had a lot of odd behaviors, including that they would make a yearly trip to Las Vegas to renew their wedding vows, the parents would, and they would dress the children in identical outfits and have them be attendants at the wedding ceremony each year. This photo was circulated internationally and gave some people their first exposure to intrafamilial child torture. So as we talk about ICT as a new category of child maltreatment, we can just briefly go over the history of dealing with child maltreatment in terms of categories. Of course, we all know that Dr. Henry Kemp started the first scientific study of child maltreatment when he coined the term battered child syndrome to describe both the physical and psychological presentation of children who have been badly physically abused. Quickly after that, other categories emerged as far as talking about child maltreatment. Sexual abuse was rediscovered again and was the focus of significant scientific attention starting in the late 70s and especially in the 80s and 90s. We started to talk about neglect. We started to talk about emotional abuse, which is also called psychological abuse, which is also called mental abuse. And we started to created these 4 categories. When I was an undergraduate social work student in the early 2000s, I was taught there are 4 types of child maltreatment: physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and emotional abuse. And that's it. And every type of child maltreatment will fit into one of those boxes. And we now know that that's not true, that all human behavior, especially something as complex as child maltreatment, can present in so many different ways. And we may need more than 4 boxes to really talk about what's going on and to be able to develop evidence base of knowledge. So as Judy mentioned before, we now talk about abusive head trauma specifically. We started out many decades ago talking about shaken baby syndrome and then realized that it's more complicated than that. We now use the term whiplash trauma because there can be other activities besides shaking a young child that can cause whiplash trauma. And we think of whiplash trauma and blunt force trauma as all under the umbrella of abusive head trauma. So that's another example of something similar to ICT, where it was an emerging category and has now been the focus of significant scientific attention. Medical child abuse is also a new category that evolved. We started out talking about Munchausen's by proxy and then evolved to a more sophisticated understanding of medical child abuse. And intentional starvation as a standalone category has been the subject of scientific attention more recently. So those are sort of give you some examples of how there can be a new and emergent category of child maltreatment. A very important paper on child torture in families was published in 2014 by Dr. Barbara Knox and her colleagues. She is a child abuse pediatrician, and the group of authors were mostly child abuse pediatricians and one criminal prosecutor that prosecutes child abuse cases. And they picked 28 cases that they had seen in their career that they thought should be considered child torture, and sort of picked them apart to glean some data from those case examples. They decided on a definition that child abuse pediatricians can use. So they said, we define child torture as a longitudinal experience characterized by at least 2 physical assaults or 1 extended assault, 2 or more forms of psychological maltreatment and neglect, resulting in prolonged suffering, permanent disfigurement or dysfunction, or death. In those 28 cases they picked, quite a few of them ended in fatalities. They decided that they wanted their definition to include or to require both physical and psychological torture for it to count as torture. They decided that there would have to be prolonged or permanent harm. The article really did some great groundbreaking work describing some of the family dynamics at work in ICT, although they didn't require it in their definition that you know anything about the parents or the family dynamics. And this is likely strategic from the perspective of a child abuse pediatrician who may see a child one time and never see the parents or get any information about the parents. So this was an important first step 7 years ago towards starting to understand what we call ICT, intrafamilial child torture, but has also been referred to as just child torture in families. These are some tables that were in the Knox article, just to give you an idea. These were the list of physical injuries their clients had experienced and the percentage of their 28 clients that had experienced these. And then this was the table of psychological abuses that their clients had experienced. And you'll have access to the PowerPoint, so don't worry about writing all this down as we go. I always make my PowerPoints available in a PDF. So you can also look up this article and get the tables online. It's an open access article. Also in 2014, a law review article came out, also discussing torture in families, discussing both torture of children by parents and torture of women by their intimate partner. And he said a few things about how he would define torture as a lawyer. So he said, knowledge that you're torturing somebody should be enough to convict. We shouldn't have to prove that the parent was purposely torturing, but that they knew they were torturing was enough. He said the definition should not require proof of extensive pain or suffering, because the torturer's actions are just as wrong, whether or not the victim is more or less resilient or more or less vulnerable, and that there should be no temporal requirement. A person can be tortured over a weekend, or they can be tortured over years. And he also said, based on his reading, he didn't believe there should be a requirement of both physical and psychological torture. That, sorry, here, I'm trying to move this so I can see my slide. That physical torture should always involves a psychological aspect, and also that psychological harm causes virtually the same or even worse harm than physical torture. Alana, do you know how I moved the pictures of everybody's faces? Oh, there, I got it, so I could see the whole slide. And he quotes from a book called The Trauma of Psychological Torture, which I highly recommend if you're interested in this subject. This is what the book looks like there. And it's a compilation of articles by different authors. And I pulled 2 different quotes here actually from that book. So an author named Fields did a neurobiological study and wrote that coercion of any type, whether it's physical or psychological torture, implies threat, fear, and powerlessness, all of which can and does impact on the brain, spinal cord, and organ integrity. And therefore, all torture, whether physical or psychological, has medical consequences and causes physical harm to victims. Another author wrote that physical and psychological torture have the same crucial feature: exposing a person to uncontrollable and unpredictable life-threatening situations of extreme stress. So I think that Brown, refers to this book and makes a pretty strong case that psychological torture can be just as harmful. And we are actually in our 7-paper series that we are writing on ICT. We are going to have a paper solely devoted to psychological torture and use of solitary confinement as a form of torture. So we found this article particularly helpful. After reviewing Dr. Knox's article, Christopher Brown's law review article, and also a really helpful paper by philosopher Paul Kenny on defining torture, we developed the following consensus definition at the Policy Center. So we define ICT as systematic and deliberate child maltreatment occurring within the child's household where they are physically and or psychologically captive and not free to leave. So obviously children, persons under the age of 18 are legally not free to leave their parents' home. They can't just walk out and say, I can't take this anymore. And even children like in the Turpin family that were over the age of 18 were physically chained to furniture and told that their younger siblings would be killed if they tried to escape. So those people were both physically and psychologically captive even after the age of 18. We believe in our definition that we agree with Brown that torture can last any period of time. It may include physical abuse that's intentional, deliberate neglect, planned sexual abuse for control, and methodical psychological abuse to purposely attenuate, shape, and control a child's moral development, psychological development, and sense of identity and autonomy, and to manifest in the child in who they are from the very beginning, subservient beliefs and behavior in service to the perpetrator's psychopathological needs. So this is really about parents that are highly disturbed and get some sort of psychological need met by torturing their children. Does anybody have any questions or comments about this definition before we go on?
We do have a question in the chat.
Sure.
Courtney asks if they, I'm assuming the child, have all of the above, but are allowed to leave, like they are not confined to the home. Is it not considered ICT?
Well, I would suppose that if someone who's free to leave a situation of torture is staying, that they may be psychologically captive. So there may be psychological reasons that they don't feel free to leave or that they choose not to leave even if they could. That would be my guess. Does that sort of answer your question?
This is Judy. I want to
Yes.
add, let me take a shot at this, because free to leave doesn't mean that they're not free to leave the house or the premises. Some of these children do go to school. Some of them do go out. The point is they can't permanently get themselves out of the torture situation, either because of risk to them from the family or for the psychological reasons.
It's very good. Thank you so much, Judy. Okay.
Katie, oh, I'm so
ahead.
sorry. Katie asks, what is the difference between ICT and coercive control?
So I would say intrafamilial child torture is this concept, and coercive control overlaps with it. So coercive control is at work in ICT, but it's also at work in other situations like intimate partner violence. And there's a particular way that we typically see coercive control used in situations where the harms inflicted rise to the level of torture. So I think ICT is completely bound up with coercive control, with perhaps more severe forms of harm than others. But that's something we definitely need to look at going forward and try to understand more about what's unique to coercive control used by parents against children.
If I can, I want to make one other point about the definition. Usually definitions are done after there's extensive research and everything is really clear as to what is going on, and it's a way of creating a uniform way for people to look at it, to think about it, to recognize it, and so forth. In this situation, the problem is we don't have research. And part of the reason we don't have research is because this is not often identified for reasons that Pamela will go into in the future, later on in this webinar. The point of this definition is not to nail what ICT is. This is a theoretical definition based on what we know about it as a place to start to help people recognize what we believe to be the dynamics and to start categorizing ICT when they come across it as a separate form so that we can start researching it. So don't be seeing this as the end all of ICT. It's a place to start, and it will very likely evolve and become more accurate when there's more data about this whole dynamic and phenomenon.
Thank you so much, Judy. You can all see Judy has been a valuable contributor to this project. She and Ron Hughes were my co-authors on the first paper that we just put out on our website. And I really appreciate your addition to that. Thank you, Judy. Any other questions before we move on to the next slide? All right. So you may ask, why do categories matter? Couldn't we just say that if you torture your children, that's severe physical abuse, or that's just more severe child maltreatment? So categories matter because each type of child maltreatment requires scientific knowledge of the unique components in order to develop and use evidence-based methods of intervention. So if we want to go from using really broad strokes to understand and treat all of childhood trauma to more a precision medicine type of approach to treating child maltreatment survivors, then we need specific and narrow categories to understand, is this type of maltreatment, what are the implications that might be different from another type of maltreatment? What type of child welfare response is needed? What type of psychotherapeutic response is needed? What type of medical care is needed? What type of spiritual care is needed? And that's, I think, been obvious when we started with our 4 categories of child maltreatment, and the scientific community outlined differences in those. And now we've moved on to things like abusive head trauma and medical child abuse. And we're able to better intervene on behalf of kids because the narrow categories lead us to narrow, specific and measurable interventions that have been found to work. And ICT is the very beginning of this process. We're trying to just theoretically develop what is this before we can go and then try to do some studies on actual kids. So ICT needs its own category because the family dynamics and parental psychology at work, and this is sort of an additional reason, are very different than typical CM cases. And using typical interventions may place the child at great risk. They might not do anything to help them, and they might actually do some harm. There are a few articles out there demonstrating that for children who have been severely abused from a young age, doing typical interventions like CBT or exposure interventions can actually make kids worse if that's done as the first treatment after a very severe history of interpersonal violence against them. So kind of conceptualizing what we call typical CM versus torture of children. We know that like the number one and number two causal and problematic factors in typical CM are parent mental illness and substance abuse. We know unemployment and poverty is linked to CM, especially neglect and poverty. We know that when parents take home a child and they have no parenting skills, they're not aware of the needs of children at different developmental stages, that can lead to some more typical CM. We know that children with disabilities and special care needs are more likely to experience abuse or neglect. And we know that families that lack natural supports to deal with the inevitable stresses of parenting are more likely to, this is a significant causal factor in typical CM. Now, here are some factors contributing to ICT that we think are a little bit different than the majority of cases investigated by CPS or come to the attention of professionals. So as is part of coercive control in general and specific to ICT, there's apparent desire for dominance and totalitarian control. There's apparent desire for total submission of the child and receiving blind obedience from the child. Scapegoating is a very common family dynamic that you see in ICT, where one child or a few children are singled out for the worst of the torture, while other children are favored and receive better treatment. Is extremely common for parents to have personality disorders, including psychopathy, which involves symptoms like seeing other people simply as a means to an end for themselves, a lack of empathy, and concerned about the level of harm the child will experience from the torture. We know in our studies of psychopathy that 50% of all violent crimes are committed by psychopaths. And we would expect this, and clinical data, early clinical data indicates that this is likely the case with child torture as well. So you have to sort of get in the mindset before you're getting ready to intervene or getting ready to study interventions that we're talking about really profound personality issues in the parent offenders. Parent offenders who torture their children manipulate the children using coercive control, techniques like gaslighting, manipulation of perception, and purposely giving misinformation. I'll give an example of that. In one of the cases we're going to look at today of a teenager named Julie, she was given all sorts of misinformation from her father about what would happen to her if she ever disclosed the abuse to anybody. He convinced her she would end up being homeless and being trafficked as a prostitute, and that all this, she would go from the frying pan to the fire if she ever disclosed. And she believed this information, and it kept her from disclosing for many years until she was old enough to understand that this was false information. Some families where children are tortured have conditions of captivity, like being tied up or locked in a room, locked in a closet, or even dynamics of enslavement where the child sort of waits on the parent hand and foot in sort of a slave master type of dynamic. And we believe that in ICT that the parent torturer is psychologically dependent on the child victim to act out this dynamic. And that's something we hope to address more in our paper that has just gotten started on ICT offenders, and something that also we think will play out once we have some more empirical studies on parent offenders. Any questions on this so far? And as Judy mentioned, this is all, our ideas based on the limited clinical data we have so far that we hope will serve as a foundation for starting a whole category of empirical studies and driving empirical data to test these ideas. We don't know what the long-term effects of torture are because there haven't been any studies, or I should say of child torture by parents, ICT. So that's something that needs to be studied. We do have one comprehensive case study that we've put together on our website that you can take a look at to get an idea of some of the in-depth examination of a child torture survivor. There is some amount, limited amount of literature on the political torture of children. So in this situation, government actors trying to get information or acquiescence from the parent, and instead of torturing the parent, they tortured the child in front of the parent. And also we can look at studies on severe abuse of children, even though they're not using the term ICT, many times these papers are describing the same phenomenon. And there are many papers that we've taken a look at where the word torture is just sort of thrown in incidentally, but they are really talking about the ICT phenomenon when they describe particular cases. These are some of the common trauma symptoms that have been identified in survivors of child survivors of political torture. And of course, trauma theory tells us that torture or another trauma experienced by a child's immature brain is going to be much more harmful than a trauma experienced by a healthy adult brain. So these are some of the implications to think about as we think about intervening on behalf of ICT survivors. There are implications. We're going to think about implications for both child welfare and for psychotherapy and other treatment as we get ready to examine some real life cases in a moment here. Child welfare, of course, when they first start an investigation, needs to think about imminent risk and whether a child is going to need to be removed immediately, or if services can be provided while maintaining the family. We believe in most cases of ICT, there is high imminent risk. Someone in child welfare will eventually need to be thinking about future risk when they're planning long-term for the child's placement and treatment. Child welfare will need to think about whether this is a case where they want to strengthen the family or preserve the family, or whether they want to rescue the child from the family and assure them that they'll never have to go back to where they were tortured again. And along those lines, child welfare needs to think about timelines in the statute. Are we going to offer reunification services? Are we going to do a case plan? Are we going to give parents a year? Are we going to give them any of the 6-month extensions? Or do we believe that the reunification should not be attempted in cases of child torture? And should we utilize the reunification bypass that was made available by the Adoption of Safe Families Act? Go straight to termination of parental rights so kids can be freed for adoption and move more quickly to permanency when we're talking about being removed from a state of torture. The treatment world will need to think about getting the child into a safe, corrective relationship, whether that is with a relative or a foster parent or some other situation where they can experience safety from a parental figure. Most children that have been tortured are going to have significant medical needs. Psych meds are often very helpful in the children that I have worked with that survived ICT. Psychotherapy is going to need to think about the implications of Perry's neurosequential model and whether treatment should start, as he says, it's an oversimplification, but treatment should go from the bottom up. So treating regulation of the autonomic nervous system first before doing things like exposure therapy or cognitive therapies. Any questions on that before we move on to look at some real life case studies?
Kelly and Anastasia have two, I believe, related questions about whether a single parent in a two-parent home or a guardian in lieu of a parent can also inflict ICT.
Well, I suppose any caregiver could inflict ICT if the caregiver is not the child's legal caregiver, legal parent, or legal guardian. We assume it would be much more difficult because the legal guardian would intervene, but that may not be the case. So we're thinking about this the way all child maltreatment can occur, which is in family shapes and sizes, all family shapes and sizes, and family or household members.
Kelly asks, does there need to be intent on the part of the abuser, or is it based on symptoms or results?
The way that we conceptualize ICT, there does need to be intent on the part of the offender. And that's what makes ICT different from some other types of use, where it may be just sort of irresponsibility or negligence that leads to neglect versus intentional planned neglect. One example we use a lot is more typical physical abuse is related to outbursts of anger and losing your temper, losing your cool as the parent, where physical abuse and torture is more planned and intentional, and often planned by a calm and cool person who wants to, who somehow gets a psychological need met by torturing another person. So those are great questions. Any other questions before we move forward?
Just one more. Lauren asks, what about kids in the family who are not targeted, and even children who are enrolled in inflicting the torture of a sibling?
That is a phenomenon that we see of parents sort of recruiting other children to harass and torture the scapegoated child. So that's definitely something that happens. As far as intervention on behalf of children who are not targeted for abuse, you'll see in our case study, I don't know if it mentions it, in one case, there were two children. They removed the tortured child and not the favored child. In the other case, there were four children in total, and they removed all of them. So that is another implication for child welfare to think about how they're going to handle that, and for the treatment world to think about how they're going to treat a sibling who was favored, or how they're going to treat a sibling who was corrupted into torturing. So those are really good points to make, that those are things that have to be grappled with as well. All right. So we're going to look at two different cases here. One of a teenager that I treated when I was a graduate student intern at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And then another child that I treated when I was at Lighthouse Youth and Family Services. We'll look at a 16-year-old and then a 4-year-old. So you really get some contrasting cases and see what that looks like in different children. So I have a few slides here that I'm not going to read to you. I'm going to let everybody take a moment to read for themselves. And then after we read a few slides of the story of this child, we'll kind of discuss. So I'll give you a minute to go ahead and read this.
It's Judy again. I want to point out that the policy paper and the entire case study are posted on the Center for Child Policy website. So this is just an overview. If you want to read the whole study, it's easily accessible to you.
Yes, this is just a much, much shorter version of the same child that we cover in like a 16-page case study on our website. Just give you another minute to read. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. Okay. One more. Wait, did we miss one? No. Okay. So what did the investigator miss here? She missed that while the physical harms Julie alleges have happened to her are not typical for physical abuse cases, they are quite typical in child torture cases. So beatings, spraying with chemicals, whether it's mace like in Julie's case, or bleach or household cleaners. I've seen this in a lot of cases. And then almost always being denied medical care for whatever the injuries are in order to cover up the abuse and the torture. Psychological harms Julie suffered, not typical for your average case that comes to CPS, but very typical for cases of child torture. So there's significant use of solitary confinement in so many cases. And we're doing, like I said, a whole paper on psychological torture and use of solitary confinement as a form of psychological torture. Food and water deprivation is common in these cases. Threats of harm, such as in this case, Julie's father threatened that he might be willing to murder somebody in the family, and total rejection of the child. She sort of missed the evidence that the nurse says she's malnourished. Of course, Julie's parents claim she has an eating disorder, and that's the reason, but it is significant. There's a problem anytime a child is malnourished. The worker sort of glossed over the fact that there's a deadbolt on the door, which is pretty concerning. And also that they admit that they spank a 16-year-old on her bottom. Not typical and definitely concerning. And one thing that I sort of hope for a lot of these cases is to make more use of child advocacy centers. In the jurisdictions I've worked in, child advocacy centers seem to only be taken advantage of when there is an allegation of sexual abuse. But these centers are equipped to interview children about also, they'll say we also do severe physical abuse, and certainly in a case of child torture, getting a forensic exam and a forensic interview can be very helpful. Parental factors that the worker kind of missed here. Father talks about wanting submission, the importance of his authority, wanting obedience. When I start to see these words, I'm starting to think about coercive control and possibly child torture. The family says that all the family's problems are Julie's fault, so there's the blaming of the victim. We know that 50% of violent crimes are done by psychopaths, and that part of psychopathy is being skilled in the use of deception. That's something that's been scientifically proven and validated. So we need to worry about the fact in any of these cases that what the parent presents may be a very convincing story that's still simply not true. And the worker mentions in this case in her notes, and this did really happen, that the parents are credible in light of being professors. But there is, we don't believe there's any connection between poverty and lack of resources causing parents to torture. We know, for example, in sexual abuse, that people of all socioeconomic levels perpetrate sexual abuse and experience sexual abuse, whereas things like neglect are more associated with poverty. So I would definitely be concerned anytime a worker is thinking that if someone's in poverty, they're more likely to torture. If they're not in poverty, they're somehow credible. So I'll let you go ahead and read this next slide quietly to yourselves, sort of the second half of the story. Okay. Let you go ahead and read this silently, and then we'll discuss. And one more.
Hold on. Some folks are saying they need a few extra minutes for that last slide.
Okay, we'll go to the last one now. Just to explain at the end here, so in the state of Ohio, that you can make a finding in the child protection court that the child was abused, the child was neglected, or the child is dependent. And dependency is kind of like what some jurisdictions call a CHINS case, a child in need of supervision. So what they did here is reached a deal where the court would only say that Julie was a child in need of supervision, and there's no finding that any abuse occurred. PC stands for permanent custody, because she was just adjudicated as dependent. She was not eligible for permanent custody or to be freed for adoption. Back in these days, I think it was less and less common to even try for adoption for an older adolescent. And PPLA, which is the status she was given, stands for Planned Permanent Living Arrangement. And it literally means that your permanency plan is no permanence. It means that your long-term plan is to stay in foster care until you turn 18, and there'll be no attempt made for permanency. This is useful for some older adolescents that don't want to be adopted and are very connected to their biological families. Unfortunately, in Julie's case, she wanted more than anything to be freed for adoption and try to find a family that could be her family for the rest of her life. And she was not given that opportunity. She moved several times, different foster homes, and then eventually ran away from foster care when she was tired of being moved around. Any questions about sort of the second half of the investigation here that led to removal of Julie? Okay.
Quick question. Any research or findings on how this outcome essentially is continued control or coercive control over that child?
Can you tell me a little bit more what you mean, like that the foster care system is exerting coercive control, or?
I believe the parents.
So yes, the fact that the parents, convinced the attorneys for CPS to adjudicate her as dependent instead of abused is the parents asserting coercive control. That's exactly right. They're using their attorneys in this case and their money to pay for attorneys to exert coercive control. And this was made this removal not a healing experience for Julie. I mean, she was very glad to be removed, but she was devastated when she was adjudicated dependent, because it basically means that they amend the complaint to take out all the allegations of abuse. The complaint just is like a form complaint that says, complaint meaning like a legal petition, that just says Julie is a teenager in need of care. We place her in the custody of CPS. So that's exactly right, that this really should not have happened that way. And it's important for us to understand that it did happen and how it happened so that this type of thing could be prevented in the future. Because every child who's been tortured not only needs to be adjudicated as abused, but there are several papers out there calling for every state to have a statute where a child can actually be adjudicated as tortured, and tortured is the word that goes on the books in their legal case. This is important for the child, and it's important for future safety should the parents ever have another situation where there's concerns about torturing a child. Does that kind of answer the question? Okay. All right, we're going to move a little bit more quickly through sort of the rest of Julie's story. So this is the same tables you saw from the Knox article, and I've just marked off all the different things that Julie experienced, so you can see how this really jives with what that 2014 article kind of thought of when we're talking about ICT. So there's the physical injuries Julie suffered and the psychological harm she suffered. You can see it's like almost every single one on the list. So how did the second investigation expand? Because I think this is really something helpful that we can learn from. So they made use of the Child Advocacy Center in the second investigation. They got law enforcement involved. They got mental health involved and ordered assessments for Julie and both parents. Mother refused to cooperate. Interestingly, father agreed to cooperate, and the assessor was sophisticated enough to pick up on his narcissistic and psychopathic traits, which definitely takes a sophisticated assessor to be able to do that. The different things child welfare has to deal with were dealt a little bit better. Imminent risk was dealt with a little better. Future risk was handled by saying that she was PPLA, permanently in foster care. Unfortunately, they did not attempt reunification, which is good. Neither did they do a reunification bypass, terminate parental rights, or give Julie an opportunity to be adopted. These are some of the long-term effects Julie had. I'm not going to go through all of these, but severe mental health problems, severe physical health problems, probably, I would say, more medical problems than psychiatric problems. And that's just, the difference of every person, how, a lifetime of severe stress and constantly, facing life or death threats, how it manifests in each person. And if you want more details, please go to our website, centerforchildpolicy.org, and take a look at the comprehensive case study of Julie. So the things the treatment world needs to think about. So this is a review from what we talked about before. They need to think about getting Julie into a corrective relationship with a new parent figure. That didn't happen. She had significant medical needs. Those were not addressed well. She was not given, I think, an appropriate chance to benefit from psychoactive medication. Her psychotherapy was not appropriate choice of interventions. And she was inappropriately given exposure treatment and cognitive treatment before she was capable of handling that. So really everything I just said is on this slide. She didn't receive the appropriate medical treatment. She didn't receive the appropriate mental health treatment. And she went on to have really a lot of permanent harms, especially the medical pieces, but also the mental health in the long term. The benefit that she did gain was from finding activities that she could do on her own that she felt were healing for her. So she did get to experience a corrective relationship of love and a safe person through her first serious intimate partner who she was with for many years in her young adulthood. I'm not going to read you this whole list but these are body-based and sensory therapies. She would just kind of either discover on her own, or when she was attending college, there would be things like free yoga classes at the gym or free meditation classes at the gym, where she would find out then about all sorts of other forms. She got involved in music. She got involved in art. She had lit a candle one day and realized that the smell was calming for her and started using the candle all the time for self-regulation when she felt out of control. And so I think a lot of these things are currently now in the literature. They're in the literature definitely by thought leaders Bessel van der Kolk and Bruce Perry. And all of their colleagues, countless more that have added on to that work. But she did get some therapeutic benefit from different activities and probably still did better than a lot of other ICT survivors would have done in the same situation. Before we go on to the next child, any more questions or comments about Julie?
I see a few folks noting that CPS, in the words of Nancy, didn't push harder on abuse charges. Was a child abuse pediatrician involved? Some different questions about the different systems in between before this occurred.
Sure. So there are always two different legal systems that can be involved. There's the child protection legal system, which in Ohio, where I've done most of my work, that's called juvenile court. Other places called family court or child protection court. And that's where you get court orders to remove kids, put them in foster care, attempt, reunification with a case plan that the court approves. And then there's also always the possibility of criminal court, which wasn't really even seriously considered in this case. But I certainly believe that a parent who intentionally tortures their child belongs in prison. And so that's something where the Child Advocacy Center can be really helpful in obtaining the evidence needed for criminal court as well as for child protection court. In this case, Julie was interviewed by the by the forensic interviewer, and that information led to, Children's Services basically getting on the phone with a judge in the, on a sort of immediate basis and getting permission for what is called in Ohio an emergency removal, where you don't have to wait to go to court. You just get a judge on the phone that's always on call. Of course, they didn't end up using that information in child protection court because she was adjudicated as dependent and not abused. She was given an exam by a young doctor, a resident in training that was working in the Child Advocacy Center, and they documented some old injuries. But of course, parents had explanations for all of them. And so law enforcement didn't seem very interested in pursuing criminal charges in Julie's case. And child welfare world sort of felt like once she was removed and they knew she was going to be in foster care till she was 18, it wasn't important, whether the paper said abused or dependent or anything like that. I disagree with that heartily, but that's kind of what happened in Julie's case. Does that fill in some of the blanks?
I believe so.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to look at a completely different case about a 4-year-old being rescued and what the child welfare response as well as the treatment world response looked like with that. And we'll try to move a little bit more quickly here. I'll give you a few minutes just to go ahead and read this. So you can see here the phenomenon that somebody else talked about siblings being corrupted into the torture as well. This did happen in Melissa's case. We'll go on to the next slide. So again, this is a review, child welfare implications that are going to need to be dealt with in Melissa's case. What is the imminent risk? What is the future risk long-term? Is this a case for strengthening her family or rescuing her from her family? Is this a case where we want to spend a year or two on, reunification services, or do we want to do a reunification bypass and free her for adoption more quickly? I'll give you a minute to read this. So you can see here, one thing that was really different is that Melissa was sort of removed immediately on first sight of the home and the situation that she was in. All the children were removed kind of without question, whereas in Julie's case, her younger brother was not removed. In this case, the worker said that because of the age of the children, she felt that reunification was always appropriate, which I don't agree with. So parents were given a case plan and they were given the initial year to reunify. At the 1-year hearing, they were given a 6-month extension. And at the the hearing after that, they were given another 6-month extension, which I didn't feel was appropriate at all because it put these kids in a situation for 2 years. They were wondering if they were going to have to go back to their family, and for Melissa as the scapegoated child, wondering if she was going to have to go back to be tortured again. They did end up with a really good foster to adopt family who did adopt them. But because they delayed the process, it took 4 years of being in limbo before the children achieved permanency. Melissa was assigned to me for me to be her psychotherapist pretty quickly after she was placed in her first foster home. This is what I saw and read in the records as well. So I would see her, first time I saw her, I went to her school to see her. She was curled up in a ball in the corner of the classroom. She was uninterested in people, uninterested in toys, didn't even look at me when I spoke to her, was sort of like not even fazed by anything in her environment. She was refusing food, both at school and the foster home, refusing comfort. She had all sort of like marks on her arm where she would bite herself and like tear at the skin and tear off pieces of skin. And the few times that she did speak, she was mostly mute for a long time. But when she did speak, she threatened to stab the foster parents. She graphically threatened to decapitate them with language I assume she must have heard in her family of origin home. She threatened to stab herself, actually got a hold of a kitchen knife, threatened to stab herself. She was very small for her age. She was about the size of a 2-year-old when she was 4.5. She was malnourished even after being in the foster home for some time because she would refuse food and water. She was getting actually hospitalized with severe UTIs because she wasn't drinking enough fluids for her kidneys to function. She complained all the time, and she did speak of headaches and stomach aches, and she did get outstanding medical care. In the county where Cincinnati, Ohio is, the Children's Hospital has a specialized foster care clinic that follows the children medically the whole time they're in foster care. They did diagnose her with failure to thrive. So things that I wanted to think about as a psychotherapist, and I also oversaw all of the treatment type interventions, getting her into a corrective relationship. So actually the very first foster home that the children were in was not a good fit, and it was not a potential for adoption. So I did a lot of advocacy to get her with a family that was willing to adopt the children should they be freed for adoption. I attended all of her medical appointments at Children's Hospital so I could have good two-way communication with the medical providers. I attended all of her appointments with a psychiatrist for psychoactive medication, and we worked together on that. You'll see in a minute what my sort of initial treatment plan looked like for psychotherapy. And I definitely knew at this point that doing an exposure treatment or cognitive-based treatment would need to wait to be the last intervention at the end of therapy and not the first thing. So I set up a treatment plan where there would be 4 psychotherapy sessions a week. I would have 1 session with just myself and the foster mom to teach her how to do therapeutic parenting and manage Melissa's behaviors at home. I would do, in the beginning, just 1 parent-child session a week, and that eventually changed. We built in more and more and more parent-child sessions. But at the very first, Melissa really found them overwhelming, and so we did just 1 a week to start with. And then I would do 2 sessions a week with her of individual therapy in the beginning. And we would do just the simplest things for basic autonomic system regulation. We would spend sometimes the whole hour just sitting there tapping or rocking. And as she got more and more regulated and could co-regulate with me, we would maybe just start the session with tapping or rocking and then go on to some of these other things like different types of sensory play, sand tray and sand play, water play, walking, stretching, doing what I call baby yoga, modified yoga poses to teach to young children. We engaged in all sorts of attachment behaviors together, mutual attunement, mirroring, reciprocity, expressing mutual liking. I have other trainings that go into great detail about how to do all this. But right now, rather than teaching you how to do this, I'm just gonna let you know what it is that we did. Melissa really responded well to all the interventions she was getting, from the child welfare interventions to the psychotherapy to the medical interventions. After only 6 months of treatment and this 4 psychotherapy sessions a week that I was doing, Melissa had significant progress in her mental and physical health. Her symptoms are not eliminated, but they were less frequent and less intense. I was so humbled that it was during a therapy session with me that we believe she smiled and laughed for the first time, at least the first time in a very long time since she had been removed. we started working on more sophisticated interventions like identifying facial expressions and body language, being able to identify social meaning of other people's presentations, doing not just simple ANS regulation, but doing emotional regulation, which is more complex, teaching how to move from co-regulation to self-regulation. And then after she had been working with me for about 2 years, I felt like she was ready to do TFCBT. And so we did that, but we did minimize some of the exposure aspects of TFCBT, and I let her lead the process. She ended up writing her trauma narrative on what she found to be a traumatic process of being rescued and then eventually put in permanent custody and adopted. And so the trauma really that she addressed in her narrative were those long years of being in limbo. Okay, so this is, I think, our last slide here, and I'm glad we have some time for discussion, time for questions. So my first question I'm posing to you all is, what was different about the CPS response between Julie and Melissa? And what was different about the treatment community's response as you see it? Alana, let me know if we have some comments coming in.
Can folks also unmute themselves and ask? Katie says Melissa received a much better response, yeah, at least in her opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Bias. CPS walked in bias on both cases.
Tell us more about
bias. Okay. In the first case, in Julie's case, the bias was these are professionals. So there's less of an immediate impression that there could be abuse, as opposed to the fact that abuse covers all categories, of people, ethnic backgrounds, professional, not professional. I get very passionate when there's an immediate response based on that. And the bias in the second case, they went in immediately expecting there to be abuse because of the situational situation. And I think both are unfair. Just because someone is in poverty doesn't mean that they want to intentionally hurt their children. Clearly, there was more than that going on with the second case, but I just find across the board, unfortunately, and I hope it's changed. It's been a while since I've been in the CPS system. I've worked in other systems since then. But I would hope that bias I would hope in today's atmosphere, we would start to remove what I see as conscious bias walking into a household, and really go in and look at what is going on in that household specific to the welfare of that child.
That's a very good point, and I'm glad that you pointed that out.
Thank you.
My name is Tyann from the Kansas City area. I mean, I completely agree with Linda. That's one of the very first things that I noticed was just the stereotyping of probably the initial response to the homes and what they looked like in those environments. But I also think that the age difference between the two is a large factor. The 4-year-old has more of a risk factor than the 17-year-old, and the 17-year-old can get out of harm's way, can protect themselves, or so that's what is assumed from a lot of CPS workers in these situations. Well, they're a teenager, they can protect themselves. They're 17, they're almost out of the home, whereas you have a 4-year-old who can't do those things. And so I think that has something to do and play into the response of these two different workers in these cases.
Do you believe that Julie could, based on the information you have, that Julie could protect herself from torture by her parents?
Me, myself, no.
And I would agree with that.
I work in, and the CPS workers that we work with, that is something I hear often. Well, they're a teenager. they're this age, they're older, that they have less of a risk factor. And a lot of our things in our situation where we are, we'll see younger children possibly removed because they have a larger risk factor, and older kids left in homes in situations like this. And so in our area, I see that happening a lot. Now, that's not my own personal opinion. I think one child's experience is all child's experiences, regardless of a targeted child or not.
Okay. What do you guys think about the fact that because Julie was a teenager, they immediately decided she would be in permanent foster care? And because Melissa was 4, they decided that parents should be given 2 years of reunification services. Does anybody want to comment on that?
Tracy shares, I think people assume teenagers act out more, make up stories to get their way, have an attitude, etc. Sarah says it's a huge disservice to Julie, I assume, to let it continue for 2 more years.
Yeah, this is Judy. There's one point that we tried to make in the paper, and that is, and again, it's bias. It's also a serious misconception that when children report really serious, seemingly outrageous kind of maltreatment, that they have to be making it up. And part of our goal in putting the case study out there and making people aware of this, the benefit of a teenager is they can tell you what's happened. Oftentimes they can tell you the whole history. A 4-year-old may not have the language or the ability to do that. The real issue is whether people are going to believe them. And if we can sensitize the community to understanding that these children very often are telling the truth, most often are telling the truth. I think it took us a long time to recognize that victims of child sexual abuse were generally telling the truth, and that the children that fabricate are few and far between. So that when they would hear it, they wouldn't discount it or dismiss it. They would take it seriously and do the deep dive investigation and assessment they would need to determine what really was going on.
Okay.
I think something.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to make another quick comment. This is Carnegie. And when we're talking about older teenagers who especially have been in an abusive situation for years or a long period of time, I think another assumption might be, as everyone else was saying, that teenagers that they only have maybe a couple more years to go and then they'll be on their own, or that maybe they've hung in there this long, maybe it won't be so bad. But I think something else to consider is that although their chronological age might be 16 or 17, their developmental age might be much younger than that because of the length of abuse that they might have endured or encountered. And so they might not really be thinking or processing or functioning as their chronological age.
Thank you. I think it's a very important point, and I'm going to tag onto that and also say, something that Julie wrote in her journal at the time was that while the law says you don't have to live with a parent once you turn 18, that doesn't mean you don't need to have a family to be your family the rest of your life, even after you turn 18, right? 18-year-olds still need a family. 25-year-olds still need a family. Even, survivors that go on to, have an intimate partner and have children and have, their adult family, they still need and benefit from having a parent figure or a family of origin, a healthy family of origin type situation in their lives. And so I think that's something that the child welfare system really missed with Julie, is it's not just, oh, she needs, 2 years of care and then that's it. She wanted to be freed for adoption so that even if she got adopted, the day before she turned 18, she would still have someone that was stepping up saying, we will be your family.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
So if we as clinicians, I know there's a variety of roles in this meeting right now, see some of that bias and that lack of effort, I guess you can say, in some of these investigations, whereas we're not investigators ourselves, we can only do so much. If we see this happening, what, it might vary by state, but what can we do? Like, can we refile on stuff that's already been filed on? How can we kind of motivate to make those changes? Because in the state of Massachusetts, sometimes people have investigated beautifully and have done a great job, and then you see people who just miss the boat, and I'm sure that's across the world, honestly. Any recommendations on like mental health clinicians on when we see that issue happening within our families?
Sure. So because of the type of work that I did as a mental health clinician, I was on a specialized team where I only treated children in foster care, only treated children that were in my agency's private foster care. I ended up, I told people at the time, probably 50% of my work hours are spent in giving people therapy, and the other 50% are spent doing advocacy for my clients. So, and you know, a lot of people didn't like that. They felt like I was stepping outside my bounds. I felt like, you know, the particular discipline that I come from as a psychotherapist is social work. So, you know, I've been training since the early 2000s to be an advocate for kids. And so, you know, I would get on the phone and I would attend meetings and advocate. I would a lot of times appeal to the GAL that the child has. If I felt like CPS wasn't doing the right thing or the court wasn't doing the right thing, I got many GALs that were willing to call me to the stand as a witness so that I could give my 2 cents about how different behavior or actions by CPS or the courts would impact the child's mental health. And in that way, I was staying within my bounds as a therapist, but also got to, you know, very formally advocate as a witness on the stand for what I thought my clients needed to be well, to be safe. And it was effective, you know, and that's how my sort of practice of almost solely treating ICT victims or victims of severe sexual abuse kind of evolved, because they would give me cases where advocacy was needed somewhere. And so I was really glad that I got to do that and got to train therapists how to do that. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
For the most part, I can do some more digging, but thank you.
Sure. And feel free to contact me as well. My email is down there. I'd be happy to talk more with any of you, either over phone call or email, to meet with your work group at your employment, to do this training for other groups in other places, and so forth. Any other comments or questions before we wrap up today?
You mentioned that there's some therapy for kids in these situations that's not beneficial and actually can cause more harm in the long run. Do you have any research articles or anything in regard to that? Often as a forensic interviewer, we refer for services and therapy services, and most, I feel like a few of the ones you mentioned are the ones that we refer to. So I just want to make sure we're keeping the child's best interest, but also want to be informed via like research and whatnot.
Sure. If you want to email me, just so I have like a prompt to respond to you, I can send you some of the articles that discuss that, and that you empirically study the lack of benefit or even the harm of exposure therapy or cognitive restructuring type therapies when they're done as the very first intervention. I can definitely send you those articles. And we already have a second paper underway on ICT, sequela, and treatment, where we're gonna dig out those articles and you know, respond with a critical analysis.
Hey, thank you so much.
Sure.
right, folks, we are super, super over time. I can't thank you enough, Pamela, for staying to answer all these really thoughtful questions. I guess it looks like we're just going to have you back when you publish your subsequent papers. If folks have questions, please reach out to Pamela directly or to online training at apsac.org. We are happy to give you access to this recording when it becomes available, as well as materials, recommendations, questions, and resources shared in this presentation. Pamela, thank you so much.
Sure, sure. I thought we had 90 minutes today, so hopefully that was what everyone was expecting.
If we have a few, do you mind saying if we have a few more
Sure.
overflow questions?
Sure.
See, Lisa, some folks are asking about your clinical work, and if you wouldn't mind sharing a bit about that, especially as it relates to ICT.
Sure. So when I was doing my MSW, I actually completed 2 tracks. One of the tracks was child welfare, and then one of the tracks was mental health. And so my training, my field placement for mental health was at Cincinnati Children's Hospital in the residential program for girls, which involved about 2/3 of the clients being currently in foster care. And so I was in training to be a trauma clinician for children in foster care. And then I worked briefly at one agency in Cincinnati, and then quickly switched to Lighthouse because it was doing some really outstanding things at that point. And I was there for about 4.5 years, where I worked on the specialized team of providing mental health services to our foster care clients. So it was really a sort of great way to have continuity of care and have integrated care, to have the foster care social worker and the CPS government social worker and a mental health case manager and the therapist and sometimes the psychiatrist or other folks as well, all around the same table. I mean, we had for some complex cases, just a sit-down meeting every month with everyone to talk about how it's going. My official role was to provide psychotherapy. So I did all sorts of different psychotherapies. I did do TFCBT and became certified in that, which I normally said I used as like the last intervention before you graduate from therapy. I also use attachment play therapies, TheraPlay. I got a lot of training in to do with one-on-one with the child, and then to do with parents and children together. I studied, I went to a whole bunch of trainings that Bruce Perry gave to understand the neurosequential model of therapeutics. I got a lot of trainings from Bessel van der Kolk. These are in-person trainings that I flew around the country to attend. And I actually got certified in what he calls body-based trauma treatments. So I kind of just worked constantly to build up my arsenal of tools that I was competent to use for this particular population. And then, of course, like I said, did a lot of courtroom advocacy based on what I knew about the child's mental health. So that's kind of my background as a therapist and how I got involved with population of kids that survived ICT.
Thank you, thank you. Anne asks, based on that experience, how do you navigate cases where maybe the internal politics or policies of these various interacting agencies, CPS, the DA, et cetera, how do you navigate those situations in the best interest of the child?
Very carefully. As a social worker, I was trained to be, out on a picket line with a big sign and a very hardcore advocate. And I had to learn to become very diplomatic, very, positively focused on, how can we all work together to do the best for the child, and not, saying, well, you guys are to blame because you did the wrong thing, or you guys are to blame because you did the wrong thing for the kid. I had a boss that really mentored me in doing that. I remember she told me once when I was early in my career doing this, she said, you get in the way of your own message. And I took that such to heart, and started thinking in every single conversation, every single meeting, every single phone call, how do I not get in the way of my own message by, advocating more aggressively than effectively. And so it's certainly something to learn. And I think it's a skill that we need to teach social workers and other types of helpers in undergrad and graduate programs. I think it's something that supervisors need to learn to cultivate in their supervisees. Because I was strong on, knowing how to do effective interventions, I spent most of my supervision time on learning how to be an effective advocate rather than an aggressive advocate. So as long as you are aware of that and make use of supervision for that, I think that you can be successful in that way.
Thank you so much. I see a few folks in here expressing questions or concerns about the effectiveness of a reunification process, particularly when ICT is present or one of the parents is presenting psychopathy.
Yeah, I always advocate for not doing reunification in cases that are truly ICT, because there are no known therapies or interventions to help someone stop being a psychopath and stop torturing their children. I mean, there's literally nowhere you can go. We have, programs that supposedly rehabilitate sex offenders. There are no, child torture rehabilitation programs to refer parents to. And, treating that kind of personality disorder where you're looking at not only narcissism, but also psychopathy, is just, there may be nothing we can do. We can, see how the science evolves. But I think that given that there are limited resources for struggling families involved with CPS, I would much rather see those resources go to families who have much more likelihood of successful rehabilitation and reunification. If you do look at the work on psychopathy, it's some psychopaths actually use treatment programs to become more savvy, and it actually raises the risk as opposed to reducing the risk. So I think those concerns are very well founded, and they're the same concerns that I have.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I have a few folks asking how the children/young adults involved in the sample cases, how are they faring today?
Melissa is faring quite well. I think because of the age at her removal and the positive interventions that she received, she's doing quite well in her adoptive family. All the children were adopted by the same foster family and are doing well, and I'm still in touch with them. I think Julie struggles a lot more. I mean, Melissa is still a child, so it remains to be seen how she will do in adulthood. Julie is an adult now, and she functions in the world. She's not in prison. She's not in a state psychiatric hospital. So those are good things. Those are places she could have easily ended up given what she experienced. So I think I'm really proud that she is functional in the world, but she really suffers. She still really suffers and has not found a medication or therapy or anything like that alleviates the suffering, alleviates the nightmares, the intrusive thoughts. flare-ups of severe depression. But I do think that she makes progress every year. So in that way, there's something, positive to be gained, that it's, it may be too late for some things, but there will always be something that it's not too late for healing in that aspect.
Definitely. And do we have time for maybe one more question?
One more question would be fine.
Okay, perfect. I have some folks asking about were either of these children ever reunified with siblings, and is that always possible, particularly if one of the child is involved in the incidents of ICT, one is encouraged to harm?
Melissa is still living with her siblings, and they're an adoptive family, and I think there has been she had some therapy with the siblings that had contributed to tormenting her. And I think that therapy was pretty successful. I think the other children were given an opportunity to sort of make amends to her, and she was able to accept that. Julie does not have a relationship with her younger brother. It's okay. That'll be the last one then. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you for your great comments and questions. And hopefully you've gained some information, some tools to go out and be able to recognize ICT when it comes before you, and do some good interventions on behalf of kids.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.